Okay, hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about variation in language. As you see, varieties and variation, features of different types of English. This is an important topic that some of you, I realize, may know, depending on what you've studied in earlier studies, A levels, or perhaps abroad if you went to secondary school abroad. Maybe even here you've discussed a bit of this if you've touched on sociolinguistics in any of your modules. Uh, it's an important topic to know about when it comes to discourse analysis because you want to be able to discuss the differences between people's types of languages, different types of English in our case. You want to be able to describe the different ways that people speak English before you then are able to go on and analyze the meaning of these different types. Why are people perhaps prejudiced against this type of English, this variety of English, where they're generally approving of some other variety. So it's an important set of concepts to know for doing discourse analysis. Now, standard English is a good starting point, right? To know what you've probably heard the term standard English. What is standard English? This was the focus of linguistic study historically, that there was this thing called standard English that was the best type of English, that was the model for all types of English that speakers should aspire to. We use the term, but it's often difficult to describe precisely what it is. Does the Queen speak standard English? But very few people use the English the way the Queen of England does. And so is that really the standard we aspire to? It's hard to pin down. Well, luckily there are clever people who've thought about this for us. Trudgill and Hannah, 2002, the references are at the end of this slideshow, have a simple, well-known, quite useful definition, right? They say standard English is the variety of English which is used in most written English and spoken by educated speakers. What does this mean? Well, written English. So it's important here to think more of, let's say, published written English. They're not talking about text messages and emails, informal emails, right? They're talking about published written English. What they mean here is, I think you can picture if you took newspapers from around the world that are called the Times, right? You've got the Times here in London, you've got the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, there's a Times of India, there's the Straits Times in South in East Asia, the Straits Times, the English newspaper around Hong Kong and so on. If you took all of these Times newspapers and read them, you wouldn't really be able to determine where they were from the use of English. You'd know from the content, obviously. A newspaper from India will have more news about India, a newspaper from the United States will have more news about the United States. But you wouldn't know really from the vocabulary and grammatical choices they make because they're relatively standardized across the publishing industry, right? They're using that formal type of English that people learn from textbooks, right? That people learn in school. They don't necessarily use it all the time, but it's the type that's taught, right? So, standard English, published written English of the type you'd see in a newspaper. And Trudgill and Hannah go on to say, and spoken by educated speakers. But now you do see that they have those single quotation marks around educated. These single quotes are sometimes called the term, they have various names. The term I like best is scare quotes, scare as in frightened. Scare quotes, as in you should, think of it this way, when they write educated with scare quotes, they used the scare quotes. They're saying you should be scared to take this term entirely at face value, right? If you think to yourself for a minute about the word educated here, standard English is spoken by educated speakers. What's wrong with the word educated here? You can probably come up with a couple of things, right? Primarily, well, how educated do you have to be to be considered a speaker of standard English, right? Primary school, secondary school, do you have to have gone to university, master's degree, PhD, right? Educated what level, as well as what type of education, right? Does it matter if your university field of study, if your degree was in mathematics or geography, or does it have to be English, which somehow then turns you into a standard speaker? So it's very difficult to draw the exact line as to where educated starts and ends. But nevertheless, there's a feeling at least that standard English is a sign of education, even though we can't. Definitions like this, it's good to think how sometimes it's very difficult to draw an exact line which delineates educated from uneducated. Put that aside, right? We can still work with the fact that there is some association between education and standard English. There's people over here that speak standard English and it's because of their education. There's people over here who don't speak standard English and it's because of their education. The middle part may be difficult to, as I said, to draw an exact delineation between the two, but it doesn't mean we can't use the definition to some extent. Now, I've talked about standard English quite a bit here because it's a very common term and a very useful term, and I'd like you to, when you use the term standard English, I'd like you to think about the fact that there is a linguistic definition, despite, however, people use it in daily life however they want to use it, but the linguistic definition is something like this. But then today's topic is actually about variation in language, about non-standard, generally about non-standard varieties. We use the term variety here to mean any type of English that has enough features to make it distinct from others, right? If I said to you, start with the easy ones, right? If I said there's a thing called American English and a thing called British English, well, in linguistic terms, you could call them two varieties of English. They're clearly both English because the speakers can communicate with one another. They're not different languages, right? If an American and a Brit talk to one another, they'll understand each other for the most part. There may be some miscommunications, although those tend to disappear as time goes on. But there are enough differences between British English and American English that we can call them varieties, right? Difference of accent, different word choices, and so on. That's what we're going to keep talking about today. In the past, those varieties, those differences were often thought of as being mistakes, right? People would say, well, those people it was often marginalized groups, right? Those people that live in the inner city, or people that live in small towns, or ethnic minorities, or working class people, they speak English differently than I do, calling myself a speaker of standard English. They speak English differently than I do. That's because they're lazy. They don't want to speak properly, or they're not intelligent enough to speak properly. Of course, we know that's not true. We know that it takes just as much work to speak in one way as it does in another way. It's not easier. So it's deliberate, and it's not accidental. People aren't making mistakes because if everyone in this group speak this way and everyone in that group speak that way, but if these people are non-standard but they always speak the same way, well, then they're following a rule, right? They're following rules. It's just that the rules are different than the rules are for speakers of standard English. So they're not making mistakes. It's not an accident, and it can't be unimportant because they're choosing to do it. I mean, people who speak non-standard varieties, which are often, non-standard English is often mocked, right? Comedians make fun of accents from Birmingham or Liverpool, although of course comedians from those places probably make fun of accents from London, right? Comedians make fun of them. People say things like, oh, you read in the newspaper, oh, people who talk this way sound stupid, right? The people who are being mocked, they know they're being mocked, but they choose to continue to speak the way they do. So it's obviously very important to them to do so, right? And of course, we'll talk more about that in a later week when we talk about language and identity, right? They're choosing to identify themselves as a certain type of person by the way they speak. Sometimes people will even pretend that they don't understand non-standard varieties Young people today with all their innits and their whats and their glottal stops and so on, I don't understand them. It doesn't take long to learn to understand a new variety of English. You may hear an accent that you're not familiar with, and it may be troublesome at first, but I'm sure you know from experience, it doesn't take long to become familiar with receiving it, with hearing it, right? It may be difficult to produce it authentically, to use a different accent, to use different vocabulary and sound natural can be difficult, but hearing it is not usually so much trouble, right? So varieties of English. As I said before, when I gave the example of British and American, sometimes people talk about varieties at the national level with examples like you see here, right? Uh, Including countries like, you could say, Indian English, Nigerian English, right? Countries where there are millions of speakers of English, both native speakers and speakers of English as a second language, right? And I'm sure you could add a lot to this list. For countries where people are majority English, you'd add Canada and Australia and New Zealand and so on, right? For countries like India and Nigeria, you could go on and add countries like Singapore and Ghana and so on, where there are lots of people who speak English, and you could keep going, right? But then, of course, we know that within each of these national varieties, we have subnational varieties, right? If you're from the UK, or if you're familiar with English as it's used in the UK, you will know this, that there are marked differences between varieties of English from around the UK, or even from around different parts of London. It's amazing to me at how well many Londoners can determine, she's from North London, he's from South London, she's from East London. You don't hear so much about a West London accent, I find, interestingly. I'm not exactly sure why, but the North, East, and South London accents are quite well delineated. So you could talk about East London variety of English, right? Things like that. Then the term speech community is used to talk about groups of people, communities, who are unified by their speech in some way, not geographically. It's not that they all live in the same place, but that they all use English in a similar way, right? Young people from around the world are unified in some ways by the way they speak English. The same, not that they'll all have the same, for example, slang from Australia through to Korea. Koreans using English slang in their Korean all the way across to here and further west to Canada and the US. But there are some things that seem to spread through different groups, like, for example, the youth, that allow us to say, yeah, people who say that generally are young people, right? And similarly for these other groups, right? Medical English. If you want a television program about doctors to sound authentic, well, it's got to look authentic. You have to have the hospital setting and the operating rooms and so on. And they should wear authentic doctors' clothing, right? They need the white robes or whatever they wear, the lab coats. But they've got to sound authentic too. They've got to use those long words, low frequency words that we don't hear so much outside of medicine. That speech variety, that language variety of medical English is quite distinct, right? Where they say things like cellulitis and myocardial infarction and so on. So speech community. You can even go down to a very low level and think that each of us speaks our own idiolect, right? We each have our own variety of English. Even if you and your twin brother or twin sister were, born and raised in virtually identical conditions, perhaps she reads science fiction and you read historical dramas, or, he plays football and you play tennis, what have you. And over time you develop differences in vocabulary. Yours becomes more specialized with regards to tennis or whatever I said, right? And hers becomes more specialized with regards to football, and things diverge, and you're never going to be exactly the same in the word choices you make because of the way you've developed your language proficiency. So you've got your own individual idiolect. Now, for studies of variation, we don't care about the individual level. That's too much detail to study one person and the way she or he speaks English. Uh, well, national level, British versus American, sure, you can go up to these much larger levels, but generally the interest is more at the speech community level, right? How do we recognize speakers of this particular group of people, and how are they different from speakers who speak that other particular variety? The variable features of English. What are the variable features? Phonological variation, lexical variation, morphological variation, syntactic variation. We'll go over these one by one. You can read more about variation, of course, in recommended readings, such as that by Milroy and Milroy that's on the reading list. Phonological variation, right? We'll use that as the first example because once you can understand variation and these terms I'm going to give you now in terms of phonology, the rest are simple. You just repeat the pattern, but instead of talking about sounds, you talk about words or about grammar. Okay, this says a variant. There's a couple of key terms. Variant. A variant is a form of the realization of a linguistic variable. What does this mean? The word realization is used here. Linguists talk about to realize something. Here it doesn't mean like I realized that I knew him from a meeting last week. Realize means to make real. I have a thought in my head. I see you and I want to greet you. I want to make that greeting real. How do I make it real? I've got various possibilities. I can say hello. I can say how do you do? I can say how are you? I can say hey, what's up? I can say it quietly. Hello, how are you? I can say hey, how are you? Much more loud, right? I could even realize my greeting just through a gesture by waving at you. Perhaps you've got your headphones on or something, so I just wave. So realization is used a lot to mean make real. Why don't we just say it? Well, because as I said, it's not just the saying of the word, it's the volume, the pitch, the intonation, and so on. Or perhaps there is no saying, it's just a wave, or it's both, right? So keep that in mind for the meaning of the word realization. A variant is a form of the making real of a linguistic variable. What I want you to use correctly here is the different meaning of variable and variant, right? Think to yourself about how you say the word water, but then notice it says here are three variants for the word water. Can you think of three different ways that someone would pronounce the middle syllable, the T, in this word? One possibility, okay, so I've written the whole word, but I just asked you about the T, but it's both there's more than one thing that can be different here, right? But let's just focus on the T. There's the water pronunciation, water. There's the water pronunciation, and there's the wa pronunciation. To go through them in the order that they're on screen now, right? That T can for someone like me from North America, we'd typically pronounce it like what is written as a D, right? Water. A British person might pronounce it as water in the second one, right? Water. And the third one, you'll see that symbol. You realize, I think, that the way I've written these words, the first thing you see is the IPA, the Phonetic Alphabet, the International Phonetic Alphabet, which you don't have to know for this module. You may study it in another module. Great. For this module, you don't need to know it. So then in brackets, I've tried to write these pronunciations just using regular English letters, right? You've got the water pronunciation, you've got the water pronunciation, and then that third one, if you look at the third letter that looks sort of like a question mark, but without the dot at the bottom, that letter is used in the International Phonetic Alphabet to represent a sound that we don't have a letter for in the regular alphabet. That sound is called a glottal stop. Glottal is Glottal, and the glottal stop is called that because your glottis, a flap in your throat that opens and closes to release and stop the air from flowing out, your glottis stops the air at that point. So that third realization of the word water is wa. And instead of pronouncing d or t, all you've done is close the airflow for a brief second, right? So water, water, wa. I'm trying to do them more slowly. Wa. A glottal stop. Try them all. Pause if you want and try them all, right? And then you've got three variants for the word, for the sound of the T here, right? What this means is that here I'll go back. What this means is that that T, but also the ER, but let's just focusing on the T. That T in linguistics is called a variable. It's spelled with a T, but there is no real pronunciation for that. In linguistic terms, that T is a variable. It has no real pronunciation. It's got three variant pronunciations. There's the North American D variant, there's the British T variant, and there's the British glottal stop variant. And in linguistic terms, they're purely equal as realizations. We know that some of them are more generally approved of. In Britain, the T variant is generally more socially desirable. The glottal stop variant is often mocked and derided for being a sign of being low class, of being uneducated. But linguistically, they're perfectly equal, and it's no easier to say one and no more difficult to say the other. And we'll talk more about the social meaning of them later. For now, we're just saying these are three variant pronunciations. And then, so as you by now can see, the ER is also a variable. It's spelled ER, but the pronunciation has three, or actually more variants, right? There's the North American there's the British in Australia, it would be more of I'm not great at this, but in Australian, it would be more of an like wata, right? Wata. So there are multiple possibilities for the T, or for the T. I shouldn't call it for the T because the T is only for some people, right? There are multiple possibilities. In other words, multiple variants for the T, multiple variants for the ER. So the variable is the one that has possibilities. The variant is the one that you use or the one that you're studying. We're not talking about meaning differences, right? So just to make sure, sometimes people overgeneralize this. Butter versus batter, or for me, more realistically, I would pronounce them butter and batter. That's not a variant, that's just a different word. We're talking about when people are using the word to mean the same thing, but are pronouncing it differently. Variants differ according to the register and to the speaker. So which one do you use? Water, wata, wa'a. Well, if you're British, you probably use the water, the wata and wa'a, right? That's according to the speaker. If you're British origin, you probably use those. But then it says according to the register, right? Well, yes, some people would only ever use wata. Some people, however, according to the register, according to what's going on around them, where are they, to whom are they speaking, the formality of the situation, the purpose, they may use wata more regularly in more formal settings, right, at work, with strangers, maybe with their granny and grandpa, whereas with friends they'll use wa'a, and more informal, more familial and familiar situations. So nobody is necessarily only using one variant, right? It's affected by both who you are and what you're doing and for what purpose. Linguistic variation is central to the study of language use, right? We can't talk about language use, about discourse in our case, without accounting for the fact that people use language differently, use the same language differently, English in our case. Two different people use English differently, but also the same person will use English at different times. And if we want to analyze those choices, why does she talk like this with him? Why does she talk like that with her? Why does she talk like this in this place? Why does she talk like that in this other place? If we want to analyze that variation, we need to have these terms like variable and variant to speak precisely. Add this to your list of all these words that have vary with them, right? There are varieties of English. Some words have variable pronunciations. The one you use is called the variant. These independent variables are those things that affect the pronunciation. In this case, we're talking about pronunciation only. We'll come to the other things later, right? People have done studies to determine why we tend to use this one or tend to use that one at certain times, right? Think of this word S. Well, I'm not going to spell it out, right? Think of the word there, swimming. The end part, the ing, has two possible pronunciations. The first one is the square brackets with the N. That's pronounced N, right? Swimmin', swimmin'. The second one, which is in the square brackets, and the N with the long tail, the one on the right, I see I forgot to write it beside the word swimming the second time. That N with the long tail is to represent the sound ing, right? So we've got two pronunciations here, swimmin' and swimming. Think to yourself, when do people say swimmin', or what type of person says swimmin'? And when do people say swimming, or what type of person says swimming? A few possibilities here. One has to do with gender. As with many things, there is a tendency, right? This is always important to remember this. And if I forget to say it, you should think that I mean this, right? Studies of language, we're often talking about tendencies. We can say more people do like this, more people do like that, more of these people do like this, those people do like that. It's pretty much never the case that people only do this and these people only do that. That is very rare. Those absolute differences where you do this and I do that are rare. But it's certainly possible to say that there's a tendency for boys to use less formal forms. Swimmin' is the less formal form. Boys are more have more of a tendency to do that than girls do. But of course, boys sometimes say swimming. And similarly, the other way around, girls are more likely to say swimming than boys are. And you could say men and women too, right? Men have a tendency to use less formal, less standard language forms than women do. But of course, that doesn't mean women don't do it sometimes. Use the less formal forms. Other things have to do with status, right? Class would be the British term here. Status is probably the American term, right? Working class swimming and middle class swimming is a tendency. Again, a tendency, right? Doesn't mean that both groups of people can't switch when they want to. And sometimes it's just controlled by grammar, which is not really what we're talking about today, but it's probably, I mean, just try it. It's easier to say something like, where is he? Oh, he's swimming with his friends, swimming with his friends. But if someone says, what sports do you do? You're probably more likely to say, I like swimming than I like swimming. It's not that you can't, just tendencies that people have measured by studying language use, right? They just record people. The main way of studying language use for all of these things is to record people talking and listen and tick off how many times do they say "n" and how many times do they say "ing," right? It's testable. You can do tests, that's what I mean by testable. You can do tests to see which of these are more common. Listen to boys, listen to girls, see who does which one more often. So these things, in this case, gender, class, or grammatical position, are independent variables, right? Independent that affect the dependent variable. How do you say the word swimming or swimmin'? They affect, this is what you're seeing here is what I said a couple of minutes ago, right? These independent variables, class, age, gender, and you can make a much longer list, right? What's your purpose? Where are you? Are you in the classroom, or are you in the library, or are you in a coffee shop? What's your purpose? Is it to entertain or to inform, to persuade? You could add all those to the overall list of independent variables. All of the features of language user variables and language use variables, right? You can add them all together and call them independent variables. They affect the frequency of variant use. You're more likely to do this when you're in a classroom. You're more likely to do that when you're relaxing at home with your sister. Um, they affect the frequency, but they don't predict it with 100% accuracy. You can't say because it's an informal, casual situation with friends, they're going to be speaking in a relaxed manner. Of course not. If your friend's parent dies, you might speak more formally. If you're angry with your friend, you might speak in a different way than if you're not angry, right? If you're just having a good time. The same as it says in the last line, the same person may, of course, use different variants, right? So to summarize that, right, the feature that you're investigating is the variable. I'm investigating this letter T, I'm investigating this syllable ER, and I want to know what's going on here with this variable. I hear you say a T or D or a glottal stop. I hear you say or a or and I say, aha, she is using the variant or he is using the T variant. And then you go into discussing why, right? Is it a formal situation? Is it because the person is Australian or from New Zealand or from Singapore or what have you, right? By now you should be able to use this to describe the second syllable in this word is a variable, right? And we know quite well this variable, it's appeared in song. Uh, do you say tomatoes or do you say tomatoes? Uh, Perhaps you know the old song by George and Ira Gershwin, right? You say tomatoes, I say tomatoes, and it goes on like that, right? About differences in pronunciation. But then, of course, it doesn't matter that the two people are different, they get together because they're in love, right? Um, Although it is strange that in the song they say, you say tomatoes, I say tomatoes, you say potatoes, I say potatoes. That works for the rhyme, but I don't think anyone actually does say potatoes, right? People say tomatoes, tomatoes, but everyone says potatoes, as far as I know. Tell me if you know people who say potatoes regularly, not as a mistake, right? What we've been talking about so far is entirely an example of phonological variation. I haven't used the term phonological variation yet, but that's what we've been talking about, right? Those variations in phonology, phono, sound, ology, study of. Phonology is the study of sound, right? But it's more precise than that because, of course, it's phonology is the study of the meaningful sounds in human speech. If I tap the table, that's a sound, but it's not phonologically meaningful. That's not phonology. If I cough, that's not phonologically meaningful. So it's the study of phonology is the study of sounds, but it's the study of meaningful speech sounds. Tomato, tomato, water, water, water. This is phonological variation, studying difference in meaningful speech sounds. It's important to say meaningful because if someone says instead of water, water is phonological variation. If someone says witter uh, because they don't speak English fluently or because they just stuttered and said it wrong, that's not phonological variation then. That's just a mistake. It's very important to remember that, right? Because what happens is people overgeneralize and start thinking that everything is variation. No, sometimes mistakes are just mistakes. It's got to be variation is when it's systematic, when there is a group of people, at least like a speech community of people who use the sound, or as we'll see later, the word or the grammar, but the same rules apply. They use it in a systematic way, in a rule-bound way. They do this thing regularly. If a mistake is just a mistake, this happens a lot because people will be talking about for example, a non-native English speaker who's learning English, who pronounces things in a different way. But if they're pronouncing it in a way that doesn't align with British English, doesn't align with American English. I mean, you can be a non-native English speaker and learn British English, American English, what have you. if it doesn't align with some rule-bound system of English with one of the particular varieties, that person just hasn't learned to pronounce it accurately enough yet. And so people will hear, if people hear it and they don't know what you're saying, it's not a phonological variation, it's just an error. And of course, over time, as we learn a new language, we get better and better and we become understood. In other words, we start to use one of the variants that speakers of that language use. In the article by Milroy and Milroy that I asked you to read, you'll see they've discussed briefly the loss of the, doesn't matter if you know the term or not, glottal fricative, but that letter H at the start of words like Hammer. How would you pronounce Hammer? Well, the first word in brackets there, square brackets, Ham, and then the upside down E, that's hammer. And the second word in brackets there, Am, and then the upside down E is amma. Let me digress for a second to talk about that upside down E. That upside down E is a very useful letter. If you're only going to know two letters from the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, you should know the glottal stop sign, which we discussed earlier, the question mark without a dot at the bottom, and you should know the upside down, is it just upside down? Yeah, it's an upside down lowercase e. It's called the schwa, 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 and it represents the sound because if we just use regular letters, sometimes an A, sometimes an E, sometimes a U, they can all sometimes be pronounced as depending on what word they appear in. So if you want it to be clear, use the schwa. And schwa in English is actually the vowel that we use most. Picture a word like B-A-N-A-N-A, banana. You don't say banana, right? You don't pronounce all those A's the same, banana. That's how the minions talk, those yellow guys from Despicable Me, banana. That's why they're funny, right? They don't pronounce words the way that normal humans do. You say banana, right? You say, hey, pass me a banana, pass me a banana. Especially the first one, you say b, even though it's spelled with an A, you say b. So if you want to make that clear, you use the schwa, right? You would say banana is B, schwa, N-A-N, schwa, banana, banana. But here what we're talking about, in fact, is the first letter of this word H-A-M-M-E-R. Do you say hammer or do you say amma? Now you could probably guess, right? Which people, if you're going to think about this city in England called Bradford, maybe you don't know it, that's fine. Just with your knowledge of how things work, can you guess at which type of people are more likely to say hammer and which type of people are more likely to say amma? What we're seeing here is in Bradford, it was found to do almost entirely with class. You're looking at the percentage of people that omitted that H in the pronunciation. And so, in other words, lower working class people, 93% of the time, omitted the H. So they would say amma and aus and is ed, and at the other end, middle class people would say hammer and house and his head. These distinctions, lower working class, middle working class, if you can go to the original the original article by Radford to see how precisely what the detail is here, but it's based on government classifications of class at the time. It's different now. The important thing to notice here is that it's not 100%. It's not that lower working class people never said hammer and house and head. It's not that middle class people always said hammer and house and head 12% of the time. The middle class people omitted the h. 7% of the time, the lower working class people produced the h. And importantly, as they say in the study, there was no single person who only used one or the other, right? Every single person that was recorded uh, sometimes did one and sometimes did the other. So those independent variables of use, language use, who are you talking to and where and for what purpose, they affected the variants that the people would use, the h variant or the omitted variant. You can't say it, there's just nothing there. The higher someone's social class, the more likely they are to use the H. As I just said, though, everybody used it some of the time. Everybody omitted it some of the time. So there's no absolute difference where some people only say this and some people only say that. It was always relative, right? Only relative one to another. We use it more than they do. We use it less than they do. It's relative, but there's no absolute division between yes or no. Absolute divisions are very rare. I was going to say there's a word in English called shibboleth. I wish I'd written it in the PowerPoint. Shibboleth, and it's alternatively pronounced shibboleth, that says those absolute differences. Right? I'm not 100% sure this is true, but there's a river in London, Thames. Londoners inevitably pronounce that the Thames, right? But tourists often come and say, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the Thames is?" I'm pretty sure that's an absolute difference, right? If someone comes up to you and asks for directions to the Thames, you can absolutely be sure that person is not from London, right? I've been talking about phonological variation for quite some time. If you understand that, you can say the same things about lexical variation, morphological variation, syntactic variation, but much more quickly because the same principles apply. You've got some possibility where something could be done in two or more ways. In other words, it's variable. The one that you use is the variant. As it says here, sometimes we've got the same word that has different meanings, right? You've got two meanings for the same word, but they're in different speech communities. For example, this pavement, excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of my drink. Sorry about that, but it wasn't worth pausing and restarting just to have a sip. There's not much left. Stay with me. Pavement, right? Seems like a reasonable definition. A footpath beside a road is the pavement in British English, whereas in American English, pavement is the material used to cover the road. The road is made of pavement, right? You can see this is a very different meaning than if someone says walk on the pavement. In Britain, they're telling you to be safe, to walk somewhere away from the cars. In North America, if someone says walk on the pavement, they hate you because they want you to walk on the road where it's dangerous. That is lexical variation. You've got the meaning difference is the different meanings are the variants. The word is variable, has variable meanings. The variant you use, the British English variant footpath, the American English variant road surface. Can be the same word with different meaning. You may not believe this, that presently has both the meaning of now, but presently also has the meaning of soon. But it's that soon definition is, to my, as far as I can see, that soon definition is dying. I mean, it's clearly, if you look in Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock will say things like, tell them I'll be there presently. So he obviously means tell them I'll be there soon, right? You can't say tell them I'll be there now because you can't be there now because I'm here. So from context, we know it used to mean soon. Well, it still does mean soon to, oh, I forgot, I grabbed a screenshot of the dictionary. Definition one, at the present time, now. Definition two, at a short time, soon. It can mean both, but the feeling of soon seems to me to be dying, right? And people use it to mean now. That often happens, right? It's difficult, not impossible, but difficult for the two to coexist in this case because they both have to do with time. It's not like pavement for footpath and pavement for road surface where they're related in that they're things that you walk on, but they're substantially different. Here, if someone uses it to mean now and someone else thinks that it means soon, there's a lot of potential for miscommunication there. Uh, so it feels like the soon definition to me is dying. I don't see it much anymore. You can read a little note on usage at the bottom there. What tends to happen is that new words or new pronunciations or new grammatical forms go through a kind of S curve, as it says here. What happens, right? You've got a new meaning to a word appears down at the 0%, right? No, if the meaning doesn't exist, we can't use it because it doesn't exist. Then it will build up slowly, right? I looked up an example that all of you know, I'm sure, is the word gay, which you all know used to mean joyful, happy. But now we only encounter that in old texts, right? Either in old books or in old songs, right? Like some Christmas carol has well, I can't think of it now, sorry, but it's in the Deck the Halls Christmas carol. Don we now, they say, don we now our gay apparel. Don, as in put on. Don we now our gay clothing, our joyful clothing, our happy clothing, because it's Christmas, right? Don we now our gay apparel, an old song. You don't encounter that anymore. Right now, of course, you know, gay means homosexual. What happens? The word first gets its first usages with a very small group of people. In this case, I looked it up when I wrote about this a bit in a book over 100 years ago now. Gay people used the word themselves as a code, right, to talk about being gay without people knowing. They start using the word gay, so it's used by a very small number of people. But then eventually the word will take off very quickly, and you see that rapid rise in the S curve because this often seems to happen once the word gets published, once newspapers start using the word. You know, people who don't really know the word, then they see it in the newspaper, or maybe they hear the word gay, meaning homosexual, but they don't really use it. It feels like a slang thing, and they don't use it. But then it seems like once it starts being published in the newspapers, for example, it's like it gets legitimized because of what we said earlier. People feel that the newspaper is standard, right? They may not like it at first, but then they keep saying it. And so it makes the word more acceptable. And so it takes off very quickly. And then soon you have almost everybody in that expansion phase, almost everybody's using the new word. Eventually it stops at termination 3, and you'll have 4, the residue. Some people will never use it, right? Some people, there's always people who say things like, you know, gay means joyful. There's already a word for homosexual, which is homosexual. So why did they want to use the word gay? That argument is largely lost now, of course. But you can see it sometimes now with things like green. Some people, if you pay attention to this kind of thing like I do, follow newspapers, you know, people will complain in letters to the newspaper and say, why do you talk about the green revolution? Green is a color. Why do you say green car? Why don't you say it's an environmentally conscious car, environmentally friendly car? They don't like green being used to mean signaling environmentalism. There's always people who resist language change and will never use it. But then, of course, what happens? Eventually, all of those people die, and everyone who's left uses the word gay to mean homosexual, or everyone who's left uses the word green to mean environmentally friendly. And sometimes the old word largely dies, like gay. It disappears, gay, in the meaning of joyful. We only encounter it ironically now, right? It was different for me. I'm 50 almost. In a couple of months, I'm 50. When I was a child, it felt like the word gay was still somewhat residually used to mean happy, joyful. There's a television program, an animated television program called The Flintstones. If you don't know it, it doesn't matter, but it's from the 1950s. So I'm born in 1971. That program is 15 years older than me at least, but it was still on television. And in the theme song, they say they sing the theme song, and then they say we'll have a something. They say we'll have a yabba dabba doo time. Yabba dabba doo doesn't matter. That's just nonsense words. Then they say, we'll have a gay old time. We'll have a, that's the last line of the song, we'll have a gay old time. And so for me, there was this kind of tension. Like I knew gay was something, but especially when I was very young, I didn't know what homosexual was even, right? I just knew gay was like something people said in the schoolyard to tease someone. But here in the song, they're saying that we'll have a gay old time, and they're all happy, right? So obviously they were using it in the we'll have a happy time. I knew of it as something sort of negative, at least not that of course you realize I'm not saying that homosexuality is negative, but that it was used to denigrate people in the schoolyard. So that tension existed there because I was encountering gay in its old variant versus gay in its new variant. So keep that in mind. I tend to say things like we've got the North American variant and the British variant, or we've got the Liverpool variant and the London variant. And I tend to talk about these things in terms of geography, in terms of where you're from. But it's important to realize that variation can also exist in terms of when you are from, right? The Flintstones, when is it from the 1950s? So it uses the old variant. Now, almost any encounter with the word gay that you'll see, it'll be using the modern variant. Keep that in mind. There's the context of place, the with text context, the context of place, where are you from? And there's the context of time, when are you from? This is a description of that S curve, but I just talked about it, so we'll skip over it. I'm not going to talk about morphological and grammatical, sorry, I'm not going to talk about morphological and syntactic variation in detail for two reasons. First of all, you already understand, I think, and you can read more about variable and variant. Good. The same things apply here to morphology and syntax. The second reason is that it's not as common, right? You hear someone's accent, you hear the variation with almost every word that he or she speaks. And new words, different uses of the same words, we encounter them quite regularly. I've lived here for a long time in Britain, well over 10 years, going on to 15 years. I still sometimes hear new lexical variants for things, right? Bonce, the other day, B-O-N-C-E, meaning head, right? That's a lexical variant. What do you call this thing? Well, the standard English variant is head, but you can call it bonce, I learned quite recently. Someone said a bee hit him in the bonce. Yeah, it was funny at the time. It's not funny now, but anyway. Okay. Grammar, though, grammar includes both syntax and morphology. Grammar, it seems to me, can't change that much, or we start to have breakdowns in communication, right? If you change the word order, I like you like I like I, you, it gets lost, right? Who's talking to whom? It's possible, but it's not as common. Just to be clear, grammar can be separated. Sometimes people just talk about grammatical variation, or they separate it into two, morphological variation and syntactic variation. Syntax is word order. Is it hot? The English interrogative, is it hot, can become the English declarative, it is hot, by changing the word order. Morphological variation is changing the word by changing just one word, a grammatical change by changing something in the word itself, right? One dog, two dogs. Putting the S on the end of dog to make it plural is morphological variation. So you see an example here. S is morphological variation in that we say, S is morphology. I walk, you walk, she walks. There is some evidence that people, both based on, in this case, speakers of AAVE, but also parts of the UK, that the morphological variant is that they don't use an S at the end of a third person singular verb, right? This dog chased rabbits or this dog chases rabbits are two possible variants for chase and for meow and for spend in C. I'll stop for a second so you can read the slide, but of course I don't have to do that because you can always push pause. Uh, in other places, there is some variation in that people add an S where standard English does not normally see an S. He spends a lot, he spend a lot, they spend a lot, I dances every night instead of they spend a lot and I dance every night. So, for time reasons, I'm going to stop now. But what I'll do is point out to you the. You can, of course, pause on any of these slides if you want, but we'll cover them in more. We'll cover these concepts together in class. I'll just highlight that the references to the Radford study in Bradford, the definition of standard English from Trudgill and Hannah, and the reading from Milroy and Milroy, which explains varieties and variation, and which you have access to on Blackboard, are all listed here. So good. Thank you very much. Take care.